Welcome to today's LaRouche Organization Manhattan Project meeting for Saturday, February 25th. And this past week has seen an extraordinary, or at least unusual, mobilization level for both the United States and the world in response to increasing awareness of the fraud of what is called the Ukraine war. This has been particularly emphasized through the extraordinary revelations that have been made available by reporter Seymour Hersh concerning the bombing of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But in fact, this is now taken on a different context with the recent release in the last 48 hours of a position paper by the Chinese government called China's Position on the Political Settlement of the Ukraine Crisis. Now, this is a 12-point peace proposal for ending the Ukraine war, which came out on February 24th, the first anniversary of the beginning of the special military operation carried out by Russia in Ukraine. Point 2 of this 12-point proposal states, and it's called Abandoning the Cold War Mentality: the security of a country should not be pursued at the expense of others. The security of a region should not be achieved by strengthening or expanding military blocs. The legitimate security interests and concerns of all countries must be taken seriously and addressed properly. There is no simple solution to a complex issue. All parties should, following the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and bearing in mind the long-term peace and stability of the world, help forge a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. All parties should oppose the pursuit of one's own security at the cost of others' security, prevent bloc confrontation, and work together for peace and stability on the Eurasian continent. So this constitutes an important contribution to a series of proposals that have happened and been provided, particularly coming from the Vatican, and coming from the nation of Brazil. But specifically, this document bears striking resemblance, at least from the standpoint of conceptual coherence, with the document issued by Helga Zepp-LaRouche called The 10 Principles of a New International Security and Development Architecture. And we want to just feature for a minute an emphasis on principle number 7, in which Helga states that the new global security architecture must eliminate the concept of geopolitics by ending the division of the world into blocs. The security concerns of every sovereign nation must be taken into account. Nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction must be immediately banned. Through international cooperation, the means must be developed to make nuclear weapons technologically obsolete, as was originally intended by the proposal which became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, suggested by Lyndon LaRouche and made as an offer to the Soviet Union by President Reagan in 1983. And so you can see, if you think about it, listen to those two sections of those two documents, you see the congruence. This is what's important about the concept of the coincidence of opposites by the idea of dialogue for a new security and development architecture. If you have different nations will approach these ideas in different ways. That's precisely why it is possible to solve sometimes, as was said before, complex matters, not by simple solutions, but by thinking through how new ideas are actually shaped. What's important about both of the documents, however, is that they both are proceeding from a different and a deeper standpoint than might be proposed. In fact, this tended to elude various of the European commentators and respondents who read the Chinese proposal and simply said, well, it's really just about sort of generalities, it doesn't really talk about specifics. And that's because these people don't understand the nature of ideas. And there's a reason they don't understand the nature of ideas. Lyndon LaRouche, the economist and statesman referenced in Helga's 7th point, who was the architect of what was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, some 20 years ago discussed in a presentation made to the Schiller Institute at the time, the nature and function of ideas and the difference between knowing something and merely learning something.
Only the human species, only the human individual can change the power of the human species, or any species, to adapt to the universe. This power lies solely in the ability of the human individual mind to do what Kant said could not occur. That is to recognize a fallacy, a contradiction in what we already believe. That is a contradiction between what we believe to be true and what the universe tells us is actually true in terms of results. Mankind can resolve these contradictions, which are sometimes called ontological contradictions, through the individual mind by making a discovery of a universal principle, such as the principle of nature, and then prove that that discovery is valid by means of an experiment of a very special type, which demonstrates the efficiency, the validity of that discovery of principle. A third step must be that we must share that discovery with others. Because if we do not share that discovery, then they cannot replicate it and they cannot cooperate with us in undertaking its implementation. The only way in which you can come to know a discovery of a principle is through an act called cognition, which Kant said could not exist. As a matter of fact, in his mind, it could not exist. You read his long, tedious writings, you know there was never a creative act performed there, nor a procreative act either. He's a bachelor to the end of his life. A man followed by a man carrying an umbrella, a servant calling an umbrella. That's about as far as he could go. Right? So this principle of knowledge is not something you can learn. If you go to a school where you say, learn to repeat the teacher's opinion, you don't know anything. You only know what you were able to discover in the same manner an original discoverer of a universal principle discovered it. For example, what's a bad musician? A bad musician is one who's learned everything but can perform nothing. He can repeat after me indefinitely. He's learned all the school books. He's learned all the routines. But put a piece of music in front of him, he doesn't play the music, he plays the notes. Because he can't put the notes together as music. He doesn't understand an idea in the music. The song doesn't work. It's sung, but it's sung as if by a machine. By some machine made, say, by the valley out there in California, Silicon Valley. But not a thinking, sentient human being. There's no idea there. So to communicate a discovery, to share it, you must cause somebody else to re-experience the same act of discovery as an original discoverer. If you want to study astronomy, you must first replicate the acts of discovery made by Johannes Kepler. You can't learn them. Newton learned something from plagiarizing a book by Kepler. Newton never discovered gravitation. It was discovered by Kepler. And the first elaboration of the discovery is in Kepler's New Astronomy, which was translated into English the first time, and Latin as well, but published in England in the middle of the 17th century. Associates of Newton copied from Kepler's New Astronomy and came up with what became known as 3 laws of gravitation. But there aren't 3 laws of gravitation. That was a mistake made by a stupid student trying to copy from a book he didn't understand. So, and then when people tried to apply Newton's laws to the universe, they don't work. because they learned to copy what was in Kepler, but they didn't know what they had copied. Therefore, they didn't know how to use it. It's like giving an idiot a machine, which is a very well-designed machine, giving him an operating manual for how to operate the machine, and he always makes a mess of everything because he has no insight, no knowledge of what the principles are by which this machine functions. So in order to have mankind increase its power in and over the universe, the individual must be able to share the experiencing of a discovery, understand the paradox, the contradiction which the discovery solves, relive the experiment of the type which proves that this is true, and then go out and share everything with somebody else. So therefore, you cannot see another person think cognitively. You cannot bore a hole in their head and look inside and see them thinking and steal the secrets in their thinking. It doesn't work. You must re-experience in your own mind what only a human mind can generate, an act of discovery. You must relive it. So therefore, only a human society in which the basis for common action by human beings is the improvement in man's ability to survive, in man's power in and over the universe, through the cognitive act of replicating and generating original, valid discoveries of principle in such a way that society is able to share these discoveries and thus act in accordance with the knowledge thus gained and shared.
LaRouche has just described to you the true nature of the underlying conceptual content of the proposal made by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the 10 principles, the proposal being made by the Chinese government on the perspective on the Ukraine war, and the proposal being made also by the Vatican and by Pope Francis concerning the notion of meeting to discuss the idea of resolving the problem of war without preconditions. And that's the true significance also of the work of Seymour Hersh, that the idea of resolving something without preconditions means don't come to it with axiomatic viewpoints. Drop what you think you believe in favor of what you can come to know. It's not a mere, for example, this Nord Stream 2 story is not a mere question of an expose. It's a defense of the principle of the discovery of truth. It's not mere journalism. It's actually called intelligence work. It's not information about what happened and who shot John and who bombed what. No, it's the changing of axioms. Now, that's the only way through which mankind can hope to survive the present moment, which, as was referenced actually recently by former President Donald Trump, is the closest we've come to thermonuclear war ever. And a lot has been changing in the past week, even including today, with demonstrations occurring, for example, in Germany. In the case of Berlin, I think there's 50,000 people there. We'll hear more about that in a few minutes, in which many, many more people are now coming to focus on the necessity for the discovery of truth. Now, we have 3 presentations for you today, which are going to look at this ongoing process of discovery of truth from 3 slightly different vantage points of emphasis. They're all the same in principle, but they're different in emphasis. And we'll start off today with, as we have often, with Harley Schlanger, and then we'll be hearing from Mike Robinson and also, importantly, from Diane Sayre. So we'll go right to you, Harley, first. Welcome, and what do you have for us?
Well, I like the fact that you said that we have similar or the same basic theme. It has to do with something called reality, that what you'll hear from us is actually something that's been tested by real developments in the real world as opposed to narratives. Now, I'm going to go through some leading developments, but let's start with the psychological warfare conducted in the Western world yesterday by all major media and political parties. the idea that this is the 1-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine, with all kinds of sob stories, testimony, recriminations against Russia, and so on. You couldn't escape it. But it starts with a complete fallacy, which is that the war began on February 24th of last year. In reality, the war began in February 2014 with the regime change coup that was carried out to overthrow an elected government in Ukraine and to impose a government initially of the oligarch Poroshenko, but now of the puppet Zelensky, who's a puppet for the NATO interests, which are using Ukraine in a war against Russia. Now, I want to start with Dennis was talking about the China proposal. Let's start with something to go back one step. You've probably noticed there's an escalation, a drumbeat for war against China that keeps gaining momentum. We shot down a weather balloon that supposedly was going to threaten to expose all the secrets of the U.S. nuclear command. Turns out it was a weather balloon. It wasn't a spy balloon. But then you have Blinken and Biden going full court against China, saying that China is preparing to provide lethal weapons to Russia. Now, this is an evidence-free charge. Those people who say Hirsch has no evidence, Hirsch's argument has much more evidence than anything coming from Blinken and Biden in their accusations against China. So why are we seeing this escalation against China, the shooting down a weather balloon, the charge that they're about to provide lethal weapons? What's the issue here? Well, you saw it from Dennis. China intervened with a peace plan and not just stop the fighting. That was the third point of their 12 points. The fourth point was resume peace talks. But it's the first 2 points and two of the last points that I just want to focus on briefly. The respect for the sovereignty of all, which was the first point, goes directly toward what Helga Zepp-LaRouche proposed in her fundamental principles. The second point is abandon the Cold War mentality, take the security interests of all countries seriously. This is something that was never done in the case of Russia. This is why you have to go back to 2014 or even to 1990-91, when the Russian security included no eastward expansion of NATO, which was promised to them, but which was violated repeatedly. That's not an example of taking security interests of all nations seriously. So this is an important point in the Chinese proposal. The 10th point, stop unilateral sanctions. We just had a conference a couple of days ago on the Syrian sanctions that are adding to the misery of the people of Syria who have been afflicted with this earthquake, and the fact that the U.S. Treasury is continuing to sanction the Syrian government out of anger that they could not overthrow the Assad government and impose a terrorist regime there. So the stopping unilateral sanctions, it's not just Syria, of course, it's Yemen, Afghanistan, Russia. They're now talking about sanctions against China. If China sends lethal weapons, they'll be sanctioned. The threat from the Biden administration. And the 12th point, a plan for post-conflict reconstruction. Now, how much reconstruction have the Western allies, the United States and NATO, done in Iraq, in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in nations they've attacked without provocation for lying reasons? Genocidal murder was committed. Whole cities were destroyed. What reconstruction is there? Well, the only reconstruction is probably going to come from China and the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Chinese proposal is an extremely serious one that addresses the problems of what do you do in the aftermath of a war. And this is winning the peace. One of the central themes of what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has done is this idea of respecting the interests of the other. And that includes the ability to survive, to have an economy that will function. And so the Chinese proposal, and I'm not going to go through all of it. You can read it. We'll have it on our website. But this is a big step toward the new strategic and development architecture that we've been campaigning for. Now, I want to just go through a couple of other aspects of the alternative reality that we're presented with in the Western world. And you begin to wonder, do people who spout this crap, Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Ned Price, Biden, do they believe this? Well, in terms of the Hirsch revelations, what are we getting from Washington? Denials. It's a falsification. It's lies. No real discussion. No discussion of what Hirsch has in the report on the repeated insistence of Western leaders, including Biden and including Victoria Nuland, that there would be no Nord Stream pipeline. The statement from Blinken that the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline is a great opportunity for the United States. These are all part of the fabric of the operation that Hirsch unravels. But instead, you get denials from Washington, hemming and hawing from Europe, a refusal of the Germans to say anything except an investigation is underway. What investigation? What are they really looking at? And then we had the UN Security Council session where the Russians insisted that there must be an investigation. And this included some very profound testimony from Jeffrey Sachs and from Ray McGovern about the nature of the Hirsch revelation. But the idea of a full investigation, where's it going to happen? Well, to make it happen, we have to keep intervening. And our associate, Jose Vega, along with other of his colleagues, are systematically going before one congressman after another, demanding that they take seriously this attack, because the attack is not only on Russia, but it was on an American ally, Germany. Now, largely, I would say as a result, or not largely, but as a result of the Hirsch story, we're seeing renewed life in the development of an anti-war movement. We're seeing growing anti-war demonstrations. The one in Washington, D.C. last weekend was not so large, but what was significant was the makeup of the speakers and the participants. It was a broad alliance that broke the profile of left and right, that broke the profile of identity politics, where everyone came together to say, we must stop the war. And we're seeing that now in Europe this week. I have eyewitness reports of people who were in the demonstration in Berlin today. Total enthusiasm for it. They say there were 50,000 people there. And this is in a country that's been sleepwalking. A chancellor who kept saying, we're not going to send this, we're not going to send that, we're not going to participate in the war, and then kept submitting to the pressure, especially from his own coalition partners. And one thing I'll tell you, which is quite significant, in her speech, Sarah Wagenknecht repeatedly attacked the foreign minister of Germany, Annalena Baerbock. Every time Baerbock's name was mentioned, there was a roar from the crowd of boos, as people now recognize that the Green Party in Germany has become the war party. Demonstration today in Rome. We're waiting to hear from London and Paris. But the important thing is that this is a beginning. The fact that you had this large a crowd in Germany is an indication that the willingness of the Germans to submit to the occupation of the Anglo-Americans in the form of NATO may be coming to an end. We've already seen it because the coalition partners just got shellacked in the recent Berlin elections. The Social Democrats of Chancellor Scholz got 18%. Baerbock's Green Party got 18% in Green Berlin. So neither of these, you add the FDP, which got a couple percent, doesn't even add up to 40% of the voters in Berlin. How is that coalition going to stay in office, especially if they're continuing to make Germany a party in the war? So that's the new reality, the breakup of the narratives. Now, let's take up one aspect of the narratives. We saw Joe Biden's Magical Mystery Tour in Kyiv and in Warsaw, where they had a real theatrical display in the Ukrainian capital with air raid sirens blaring when there was no air raid, no shooting, no nothing. And Biden stumbling through the city with Zelensky and promising more money, another $500 million while he was there with Zelensky, when people in East Palestine, Ohio were wondering when are they going to get some help to clean up the toxic mess from the train derailment. Another flow of money, adding up to somewhere close to $112 billion pledged so far from the United States. And what did Biden say? We have a global coalition. The whole world is with us. Well, even the warmongering Washington Post had to recognize that that's a lie. The idea that there's a new coalition of the willing, first they should take a look at the last coalition of the willing, the Iraq War. What was the result of that? A long war, extended casualties of Americans, huge number of deaths of Iraqis. And was there ever a reconstruction? Was there anything done to help Iraq? No, in fact, ISIS grew out of the prison camps that were run by the United States and NATO. So if that's the example of a coalition of the willing, certainly Ukrainians are smart enough to not want to be a part of that. So the idea that the whole world is on the side of the Ukrainian war of NATO. Let's just take a look at a couple of articles in the Washington Post. Headline article, global divide on the Ukraine war is deepening. Then a second one, on the same day, this was on Thursday, Biden rallies the West, but what about the rest? And in that one, they cite a European Council on Foreign Relations report, which describes a, quote, fragmented, fractured world, hardly in sync with the geopolitical West, unquote. And then an article today by someone who's part of the war machine, Josh Rogan, but who had to admit after attending the Munich Security Conference, which was a cheerleading session for more weapons, more arms, for more Ukrainian deaths, Rogan said the Ukrainians who were there told him that Biden's line in Kiev, that time is on the Ukrainian side. Rogan said time is not on Ukraine's side, that the war is not going well. So the narrative that you're getting, the Russian military is weak. I mean, it's interesting. If the Russian military is so weak, why does Ukraine need $150 billion of new weapon systems to combat it? If the Russian military is so weak, why do NATO officials keep saying we have to provide these weapons or else the Russian army will be in Paris? These are obviously transparent lies designed to give a continuing commitment to this war against Russia. Now, Chatham House, one of the British intelligence think tanks that's been part of this war buildup from the beginning, had a symposium where they literally were cheering on the war and how it's going so well. But even at that, they had to make some devastating admissions. One of the speakers said, quote, Asia has largely rejected Western framings, unquote. Someone from their Africa program said, quote, non-alignment is much more comfortable for African nations than joining the war against Russia, unquote. This is a recognition that the global South is moving in a different direction. Now let's take one of the other narratives, that the sanctions have been a success and Russia is isolated. Well, as these other statements show, Russia is not isolated. Russia has minimally the support of much of the global South. There's an expansion of trade going on. The deal was just signed for a ruble-rupee transfer agreement. The advances in investment coming from the Belt and Road Initiative, the trade deals, the expansion of trade with Russia, with a number of these countries, all of them show that the sanctions are not working. Now, we were told that, well, actually, this is the funniest one yet. There are new sanctions that were just voted up, the 10th package against Russia. One of the provisions of this new sanction regime is sanctions including toasters, microwaves, and hair dryers, with the argument being that there's electronic components in those items which have a dual use capacity, which could be used for weapons. Well, you have to admit the Russians are having a bit of a sense of humor about this. There are cartoons in Russian papers showing Russian soldiers advancing in Ukraine carrying toasters and washing machines. Now, even David Ignatius, a leaker for the CIA who works at the Washington Post, I should say a recipient of CIA leaks, had a story about the failure of sanctions, and he said, Russia is not crippled. Now, the reality is it's the West that's being weakened in ways that are really quite significant, because the rest of the world is now moving away from the dollar system. They don't trust Western banks, not simply because they run debt scams against them through the International Monetary Fund and so on, but because if you put money in a Western bank, you're liable to get sanctioned and lose it. But the bigger question here is who has the economic capacity to deliver reconstruction? The United States, we can't reconstruct our own highways, our own healthcare system, our own schools. The United States is not an example for the rest of the world anymore. But who's doing that? Who's providing development aid in the sense of increasing the productive capability of nations? It's the Belt and Road Initiative. It's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. And these are institutions that are part of a new financial system and a new economic development system, which gets at heart to the whole question of why there is a war in Ukraine. Because this new financial system, this new economic development system, is a threat to the collapsing existing unipolar world. And the decision to weaken Russia, to make an example of Russia, was taken not because of Ukraine, because the people who are doing this, they don't give a damn about Ukraine. I don't care how many of them go and walk through the streets with Zelensky. What did they do after the so-called Ukrainian revolution, the regime change coup of 2014? How did they help Ukraine? They sent in the vultures of the International Monetary Fund who started privatizing everything. And who's the beneficiary of that? The Ukrainian people? No, their standard of living is dropping, even long before this special military operation started. Who's the beneficiary? BlackRock, Vanguard, the grain cartels who are moving in to buy up the newly privatized wealth of Ukraine, which is something that the Russians would protect, something that Yanukovych would have protected. So this whole narrative on the economy is exposed as a fraud. Now, let me just get to the final point, because the whole wall of narratives is cracking. I've gone through some of these points, but let me give you an example of what's being done to protect it. There's something called the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Lab, which is supposedly the most up-to-date capability to counter disinformation, which means it's the leading disinformation producer in the West. And they just put out a long report called Narrative Warfare: How the Kremlin and Russian News Outlets Justified a War of Aggression Against Ukraine. Now, what do they cite as proof of ill intent of commentators and news sources that don't go along with the whole narrative? Well, they say this is intelligence warfare, information warfare, and that, quote, routinely citing Putin, unquote, may constitute a war crime. That is, if you quote the president of Russia in his discussion of why he undertook the special military operation, that's a war crime, because they're saying it's false, it's disinformation, and the reality is that what Putin has said, if you do a real fact check, you'll find that he's right about NATO eastward, the creep of NATO eastward. Is Putin wrong about that? Is he wrong about NATO moving sophisticated weapons to the border of Russia? Is he wrong about the murder of people in the Donbass? I had a debate the other day on an interview show with a Ukrainian lobbyist who denied that there were any people who were killed in the Donbass. And when I said many of these people were Russian-speaking civilians, he said, that's a Russian conspiracy theory, and I reject the characterization of those people as Russian-speaking. So who's responsible for the narratives? The people who are pushing the war. Now, I wonder if I'm labeled an information terrorist because occasionally I quote something from Putin. Does that make me an information terrorist or a Biden agent if I quote something from President Biden? Well, people should think about these things. Reality is asserting itself, and the American people and the people of Europe may be ready to wake up. If the crowd that turned out today in Berlin is any sample of this, because there were real attempts to disrupt the demonstration. The weather was terrible. It was snowing some of the time, raining some of the time, and yet 50,000 people showed up to insist that the war must end and that Germany must stop participating by providing weapons to Ukraine and NATO. So we're at a new point now, and I'll stop at that.
Harley. And if you've just joined us, you've just heard Harley Schlanger, spokesman for TLO, and we're here for our Manhattan Town meeting. Now we're going to hear from Mike Robinson, editor of UK Column. 5 days ago, Mike was part of a symposium sponsored by the Schiller Institute called Syrian Sanctions Must Be Lifted. His colleague Vanessa Beeley, British activist and writer and expert on Syria, joined us at that time. But technical problems, or perhaps it was the physical economic breakdown of the UK, I'm not sure, prevented Mike from giving the presentation as planned. He's here today not only to discuss particulars on one or another area of the world, but rather the dynamics as well as the mechanics of how we are being continually bamboozled, manipulated, and hornswoggled by various elements of British intelligence and its extensions. So, Mike, good to see you, finally.
Thank you. Yes, well, thank you. Right, just before I get started, I'll just mention there was the Stop the War Coalition March demonstration in London today. I haven't seen all the details of it yet. I think it was pretty well attended, but there was a counter demonstration, and I think Harley said that the US protests in Washington on Sunday broke the profile of identity politics. It was interesting that the person leading the counter demonstration, the pro-war demonstration in London today, was a guy called Peter Tatchell, who is absolutely leading identity politics in the UK, has been for many, many, many years. He is a gay rights activist and campaigning against hate crime on the internet and so on, depending on how you define hate crime. So I just thought it was interesting that the counter demonstration, the pro-war demonstration in London today, to counter the Stop the War Coalition demonstration, was being led by somebody from that kind of political activism. Now, I'm just going to very quickly, I'm going to cover two main topics today. I'm going to very quickly run through what I was going to do on Tuesday, because it feeds into how the narrative is built and so on. And then I'm going to move on to another aspect, not related to Syria, of how the narrative is built. So let's start off with, well, we've mentioned it before, but BBC Media Action, because the sanctions in Syria, which continue, US sanctions, EU sanctions, and UK sanctions, are the justification for it is led by the media narrative. Politicians, sure, but if it wasn't for the media narrative, it wouldn't gain popular support, if it has any. But BBC Media Action, they describe themselves as the BBC's international charity, funded largely by the Foreign Commonwealth Office. BBC Media Action, they say, an international charity, we believe in media and communications for good. They don't say for whose good. Last year, they say we reached more than 130 million people in some of the world's poorest and most fragile countries. Our projects and programs save lives. Again, they don't say whose lives. Protect livelihoods. They don't say that either. They counter misinformation, challenge prejudice, because they are pushing LGBT rights in many, many countries, for example, and build democracy. That's how they describe it. So what they do is they do this in two ways. They go into countries, they train the local journalists in countries. They did this in Syria, and we'll show you that in a second. They're doing that, or they did this in Ukraine over the last few years. And in fact, they helped reconstitute the Ukrainian equivalent of the BBC, a public service broadcaster, in order to make sure that they're producing the right kind of news for Ukraine over this last couple of years. So I've shown Juliet Harkin before, but here she is. Just think about this. She was talking about in Syria from 2004, so several years before any of the war began, working with individuals within the Syrian ministry who wanted change and tried to get them to be the drivers of that. So this isn't about helping a country. Well, it might be about building democracy, depending on whether you think that's a good idea or not. But they're certainly looking for opposition to be drivers of that opposition. And then they're talking about media development work predicated upon the idea that there can be change from within. You have an authoritarian regime and you find who the reformers are and you work with them. So this is a very key aspect of how Britain is influencing opposition movements within countries where they want regime change. But they're also building a media framework within those countries, which then helps inform the media narrative in the UK or in the EU or in the United States. And this is a very key part of it. It's a very circular solution. It's an excellent solution for a government that wants regime change, because they can then find a source of so-called on-the-ground local journalists who can feed narratives back into the BBC's domestic politics and so on. Now, Vanessa certainly on Tuesday mentioned the white helmets, and this is absolutely a UK intelligence service front, if you want to say. They're certainly funded by the Foreign Office, initially set up in 2013 by James Le Mesurier, who was, because he's dead now, an ex-British military intelligence officer, and is financed mainly by the British government. And they claim to be first responders. So they go there with their white helmets, and they're supposed to be digging people out of the rubble in Syria during the period of the war. But of course, most of the, if not all the footage that we ever saw from the white helmets was extremely high production value. It was a PR exercise. It was designed to push narratives back into the West to justify Western interference in Syrian affairs. But it's not just these types of NGOs and money coming in. It's direct influence also from politicians. So during the course of the Iraq War again in 2013, a Tory politician, a guy called Brooks Newmark, was working very hard to give moral support to the Syrian opposition in Syria, but then bringing back his stories and publish them in the Mail Online and so on, in order to try to drive justification for bombings campaigns. Now, in 2013, we came very close to entering into bombing campaign in Syria, but unfortunately, it didn't quite happen. And in fact, what was fascinating about this whole thing was that David Cameron, because of public pressure, and many campaigners like Vanessa Beeley have a lot of credit to be taken, because they built a campaign to get the potential for bombing in Syria in 2013 stopped. David Cameron was forced to hold a vote in the House of Commons, and that vote was lost. And as a result, the UK decided not to bomb Syria at that time. Now, as a result of that, the United States were not able to justify bombing, or at least going in unilaterally. And I just thought I'd highlight that, because I thought it was an interesting example of the dynamic. Because as we've listened to the narrative over the last several weeks and months over Ukraine, the narrative that we're getting from certain circles is, where Britain leads, the rest follow. And I thought that was an interesting example of where, if it can be stopped in Britain, often it can be stopped elsewhere as well. But coming back to the BBC for a second, in terms of narratives and so on, in 2013, on the day, or in fact it was the night before the vote about whether to bomb Syria, the BBC produced a documentary which they showed a portion of on the evening news programme. The documentary was called Saving Syria's Children. I'm just going to show a quick clip of that just to give you an idea of the type of propaganda that the BBC has helped produce, because it turned out that this story was completely fake. That obviously has quite high production values in terms of, there's a bit of money spent on that particular report. That ended up being a significant documentary involving quite a lot of people. But as I say, it was shown to be less than honest or truthful. It was staged, in other words, and that was very much used to try to push for support for specific boots on the ground intervention in Syria. Now, a colleague of mine, Robert Stewart, has a blog about this. If you want to have a look at this in detail, it's Fabrication in BBC Panorama's Saving Syria's Children. It's on Blogspot. You go and have a look at it. In the meantime, after the vote and the disappointing result as far as David Cameron was concerned, Brooks Newmark, the Tory MP that we were talking about a second ago, filled the media with stories. How can I look these guys in the eye? He was really trying to push for a reversal of the decision. And to the left of him, there is General Idris, who was the head of the Free Syrian Army at the time. But unfortunately, Brooks Newmark didn't succeed in maintaining a political career for very long after this. As we mentioned the last time I was on this programme, he, like many of his colleagues, ended up with his pants down. In fact, he resigned because he was caught sending nude images of himself via social networking websites. So typical Tory, I suppose. But look, the government, the UK government, is pushing loads of money into Syria. And of course, by 2015, they were already publicising this in a big way. So supporting efforts to find a political solution. They weren't doing anything to find a political solution in truth. They were, in fact, funding and supporting not only the White Helmets, but attempting to build an opposition government, or a government in exile, ready for Assad to be deposed, they were hoping. Now, then the White Helmets, of course, constantly in the media, it was absolutely, over the years, a pretty steady flow of propaganda from the White Helmets pushed by the British mainstream press. We even had the London Fire Brigade inviting the White Helmets to them to see, in order to produce more news stories, more PR. Academia as well got involved. So here's Scott Lucas with an organisation called Turan. I'm not going to go into this network in any detail, but if you look on the above, Scott Lucas has got links to Chatham House. But to the right-hand side then, we have connections with various people right through Mayday Rescue and ARC to the White Helmets and James Le Mesurier, who started the White Helmets in the first place. We had Boris Johnson, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, heading over to Turkey, to Gaziantep. He was holding talks with Turkey's leaders, but he was also providing more money at the time. So he very keen to meet Raed Saleh, the leader of the White Helmets. And then we also had not just the BBC, but Channel 4. Channel 4 in the UK is another public service broadcaster. It's not funded by the taxpayer in the same way that the BBC is, but it is a public service broadcaster. And they actually became a very significant mouthpiece for the White Helmets, for the opposition in Syria over the years, all justifying the ongoing sanctions and justifying the ongoing money flows from the taxpayer into the White Helmets and the armed opposition in Syria. Now, I think this was 2018, RT interviewed Andrew Mitchell, MP. Andrew Mitchell is the current International Development Minister, but he was asked some interesting questions, so let's just have a listen to this.
And all these years, and all these millions, hundreds of millions of pounds worth of British money, where did it all go? the British taxpayers' money has been absolutely vital in keeping alive and sustaining one of the world's other worst humanitarian crises. Millions of people who have been absolutely dependent. After all, Britain has provided more support for the refugee camps around Syria, in Jordan particularly, Lebanon, Iraq and Turkey. Britain has provided more support than the whole of the rest of the European Union added together.
That may be the case,
spending of British money is absolutely vital.
Better to be
on
preventative.
humanitarian grounds.
Okay, but better to be preventative. I mean, we have a report here. We have a leaked memo from the Conflict Stability Security Fund talking about 200 million going to all manner of different activities, which don't seem anything to do with trying to create peace. They seem to be supporting Islamists in Syria.
Well, I think that
will they be returning home to do harm here in Britain?
That is a highly doubtful statistic. Britain has been working.
I have the leaked memo here. 18 million in peace, but 32 million being given to moderate armed groups, 54 million to the White Helmets, which has now been linked to ISIS, Daesh, and Al-Qaeda linked groups.
The White Helmets very nearly won a Nobel Peace Prize.
And
the White House. I know that the
so
Russians,
did Henry Kissinger.
I know the Russians think that the White Helmets are an Islamist front, but actually the clear evidence that we had in Britain was that the White Helmets were incredibly brave men and women in Syria going to the rescue of people under attack from Russian and regime bombs.
Despite all the evidence to the contrary.
I think what you're saying about the White Helmets is extremely contentious, and I'm satisfied from the work that Joe Cox and I and others have done on the all-party Friends of Syria group that the work of the White Helmets was enormously valuable in humanitarian terms.
So enormously valuable in humanitarian terms, he claimed, but the fact of the matter is that the money that they received was non-humanitarian aid. It was specifically categorized as non-humanitarian aid, and you would have seen that on one of the earlier screenshots I showed you. But now we've had an earthquake, or the Syrian conflict has died down to a large extent. The so-called rebels, the terrorists, are mostly in the northwest of the country in Idlib, and there's been this horrendous earthquake. And this has been used as a massive excuse, as Vanessa was saying, to start refunding the White Helmets, and we're starting to see the outcome of that. So let's just have a look at who's funding them. Well, first of all, the UK is committing to additional funding to the White Helmets to support search and rescue efforts in Syria. It was never about search and rescue efforts, but anyway, the White Helmets themselves very keen to thank the British delegation for their money. And here's Andrew Mitchell that you've just seen on that RT discussion. Honoured to meet the White Helmets heroes involved in search and rescue. Not really, but anyway. We've got Antony Blinken, very pleased to meet them as well and to give them $100 million. We have the Qatar Fund for Development giving them money. We have the Canadian government giving them another $10 million. We've got Denmark giving them $10 million. So they've got some nice new clothing and much stronger brand and so on. And the other thing that's interesting here is that some people have been attempting to set up crowdfunding efforts to try to get some support into the majority of Syria, which isn't supported by the West. Those crowdfunding efforts have been shut down. GoFundMe shut down the main fundraising effort. But they're not shutting down, and many of the crowdfunding sites are not shutting down efforts to raise money for the White Helmets, of course, because this is approved money. It's not going into Syria, it's only going into Idlib, or at least it's only going into the very northwest of Syria, certainly not going into Aleppo and places like this. But the White Helmets taking advantage of it with their high production values, PR exercises again. And what's fascinating about many of the videos, if not all the videos that are being produced, is that various children are being pulled out from under the rubble by the White Helmets, no dust, clearly not stressed in any way. And so as happened during the war, these are staged events, PR stunts, and so on. So GoFundMe here, more than $100,000 raised to help support the White Helmets. And in London, then a few days ago in Trafalgar Square, City Hall, this is Sadiq Khan, who's the mayor of London. City Hall is assisting the Syrian community in creating Syria House, a space where they can pay their respects. This is to the earthquake victims. I signed the book Condolence, and in Trafalgar Square, King Charles helped launch Syria House, a temporary Syrian community tent where communities, the Syrian community, where members of the Syrian community can come together and support those who need it most. This is all about fundraising for the white helmets, and you can see Prince Charles being handed a white helmet there on the right-hand side. And so what is the outcome of this? Well, of course, more money flows into Idlib, where the extremists are and the terrorists are, and we start seeing already terrorist activity in Syria, with another ISIS attack a few days ago, 53 Syrians killed, and so on. And I just want to end this part of the segment with Andrew Mitchell again, because he was interviewed on the BBC a couple of weeks ago, and he was asked specifically if the British government would be removing sanctions in order to allow people to send money to the Syrian effort, to the Syrian government's effort to try to save as many people that were affected by the earthquake in Aleppo and other places that aren't, shall we say, Western supported, as with Idlib. So let's hear what he had to say.
What Britain did was to get aid to the White Helmets, who were the civil defence group during the war in Syria. They were the first responders, pulling people out from under the rubble, and we got money through to them so that they could provide for support, put petrol in their cars, and get into action. And Britain was doing that right at the beginning.
But I know that you follow this issue very closely for many years. Is the way that President Assad is behaving costing life?
Well, it's too early to say, because the significant support is coming through the UN there. And as I say, that is well coordinated. And the UN is in Damascus. The UN is able to deal with the Syrian authorities. And my information is, so far, that is working comparatively well.
What about sanctions? Because Syria has been under tough sanctions for a long time because of President Assad's activities. America has said, hold off some of the sanctions for now to help get relief in. Is the UK going to do that too?
Well, we will do everything we can to ensure that aid gets through to the people who are suffering. Well, the sanctions affect, for example, the ability to get money into the area, and we are finding ways all the time to achieve that successfully.
But would it be easier if you relax the sanctions? Because the United States has said they will ease off some sanctions. Is the UK going to follow that example?
Well, specifically here, where sanctions would hold us back in any way, we would seek to have them lifted. But at the moment, we are able to get what we want through, and that's the key thing. We're still at the stage where people are being pulled out of the rubble, as we've seen British firefighters pulling them out in Turkey, and that is the key thing we have to do at the moment.
But you may ease them as time goes on, you're suggesting, for these specific reasons, if needed. Okay.
If necessary, he will push for that, which means no. So I don't see any chance of lifting sanctions as a result of this earthquake. Quite the opposite. We're seeing more and more British money, but also international money as well, going into the extremist groups, so that we are basically have been on the receiving end of a significant amount of the White Helmets PR once again. So that was the Syria sanctions aspect of it, controlling the narrative. But how else is the narrative being controlled? And this isn't so much a British thing, it seems, on the surface. But let's have a look at this Haaretz article that came out a week or so ago. It's titled Hacking, Extortion, Election Interference. These are the tools used by Israel's agents of chaos and manipulation. This little website was animated and so on. This was about an organization called Team George or Team Jorge. I'm not really sure how it's supposed to be pronounced. But let's just have a quick look at what Haaretz was saying here. They were saying that it was a business that offers foreign information, manipulation and intervention, dark services to the highest bidder, digital surveillance, hack and leak smear campaigns, influence operations, disinformation, election interference and suppression. They were saying that it's usually attributed to states or state agencies in countries such as Russia or China. But Israeli, that should say brothers, apologies for that, Tal and Zohar Hanan, had been active for more than a decade and boast of meddling in 33 presidential elections around the world, 27 of them successfully. The array of tools at their disposal to achieve these ends include cyber attacks, transnational disinformation campaigns, forged documents, incrimination of political adversaries, dissemination of fake reports, theft of bank documents. They also claimed that they had, as we say, meddled in presidential elections. They said that Haaretz got some inside access, and so they were taken on a tour of private conversations being conducted by cabinet ministers in Kenya and Mozambique in Gmail accounts and in Telegram. It was explained to the clients that George had hacked the correspondence of prominent African personalities while providing service to other clients. And they also claimed responsibility for a cyber attack that was intended to sabotage the Catalonian independence referendum in 2014. On top of that, this came a presentation of software. The system ran what was described as an army of avatars, this fake identities on social media sites, disseminating rumors, harassment, defamation, or praise, whichever the client was asking for. And at the heart of their service, they had a piece of software which was called the Advanced Impact Media Solutions. And this was a disinformation system being revealed for the first time. A software system capable of creating and deploying fake accounts across social media at scale without detection, developed by Team George to serve as a versatile online influence and social media manipulation tool. With one click, it generates a new name, ethnicity, nationality, language, hometown, and more for the new fake identity on social media. It provides them with a whole background, a CV, makes it look as close to being a real person as possible. Photographs, now they're stealing photographs off the internet and attaching these to their avatars. So people are, these fake profiles are using real photographs of real people. So they gave an example. They created an avatar for the reporters, a woman from the United Kingdom. He didn't like the generic British name his system initially provided, so hit a button and generated a new name, Sophia Wilde. I like the name. Her photos, the investigation found, belonged to a real woman who had no idea her likeness was being used to demonstrate influence operations. And he created this new, sorry, that's a duplicate. So that was the Haaretz coverage of it. The Guardian covered it in the UK. And the names associated with the article here are quite interesting because, for example, Carol Cadwallader, absolutely 100% linked to Integrity Initiative, absolute Russophobe. But some of those other names like Stephanie Kirk-Gessner and I think Jason Burke as well, also pushing very anti-Russian narratives and certainly anti-Syrian narratives over the last number of years. Now, the organization that revealed this or exposed this, published in multiple outlets around the world, including Haaretz, because Haaretz had the internal access to the team that was behind the particular team they were highlighting here, was this organization, Forbidden Stories. And the project that this effort is through is called Story Killers. But just to highlight that Forbidden Stories receives money. Their main donors for this, people like the Limelight Foundation, Luminate, National Endowment for Democracy, Open Society Foundations, Skoll Foundation, UNESCO, Veronica Foundation, Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, and so on. I don't know very much yet about Forbidden Stories itself. I am fascinated that the names that have been chosen to actually push this story in the UK are names that we have in the past associated with pushing stories which are anti-Russian or anti-Syrian, certainly anti-Chinese as well to a large extent in the past. So there's still a lot of work to do on this particular exercise, but what it demonstrates is just how social media is being, how the narrative is being controlled in social media, how it's been weaponized, how it's been industrialized in some way. Because this and I think this is producing thousands of avatars, fake accounts, which look like real accounts, and is being used to not only push out information which is consistent with government narratives, but is being used to attack those who are offering counter narratives as well. So anyway, that's what I have for you this evening.
Thank you very much, Mike. And if you've just joined us, welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting. We've just heard from Mike Robinson from UK Column. And he has given more than a comprehensive discussion about some matters. We want to reference this with respect to Syria and the Syria sanctions business. On Tuesday, a meeting was held, a symposium called Syrian Sanctions Must Be Lifted. It was keynoted by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and at that time, the point was made that there needed to be a full rollback of United States sanctions. We also made the point that the United States is occupying nearly a third of Syria right now, and most Americans don't know that. To that extent, I want to call people's attention to something that we'll probably be able to put up on the screen later once we have the actual bill. But there's a Florida Republican congressman by the name of Matt Gaetz, and he put in what's called a privilege resolution into the Congress. And it needs to be passed in the next 15 days. But what it does is it would demand the withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Syria within 15 days of the passage of the bill. So this is what he had to say. What happened was there was a press release on the 17th of February from U.S. Central Command that talked about how various U.S. service members had been wounded in a series of helicopter raid in northwestern Syria. So this brought this to Gaetz's attention, and he said, quote, "Congress has never authorized the use of military force in Syria. The United States is currently not in a war with or against Syria. So why are we conducting dangerous military operations there? President Biden must remove all U.S. armed forces from Syria. America first means actually putting the people of our country first, not the interests of the military-industrial complex. Now, the point is that what he's saying here is, do we really want to continue the Obama-era policy of engaging in a serious civil war? I don't think we should. But again, what is also not recognized is that under the guise of humanitarian aid, what's actually happening is that the conflict is being restarted, including with the government. And unlike Russia, for example, or which was asked to come into Syria, the Americans were never asked to do that, and they're there now. They're there now as an occupying force in the northern part of the country where the oil is. So what we want to do is to take the initiative and the momentum from the rallies, the anti-war rallies and the protests pertaining to the Seymour Hersh revelations around Nord Stream 2, and direct them to doing something very concrete in the next 2 weeks, which is to get these sanctions completely lifted. There are many church organizations, apparently the World Council of Churches and others have taken stands on this, but we bring this to your attention as we go into our final segment. Now, we mentioned before the Sunday rally of Rage Against the War Machine, which occurred this past weekend, and one of the keynote speakers there was Diane Sayre. We're going to show Diane's presentation on that occasion, and then have her speak about not merely that rally, not merely about what comes next, but also about why she said what she said when she addressed this group, which was very, very different than the other speeches given.
Good afternoon. I want to especially thank Nick and Angela for pulling all of us together. And I am pleased that we have smoked out hundreds of FBI agents and thousands of NATO trolls just by sticking together to oppose our nation from plunging us into the abyss of thermonuclear war. We are here because there seems to be no bottom, no boundary to the depravity of our own government. They would never do that. Has been violated repeatedly to the point that we can be almost certain that if we, the people, don't step in, we are headed over the cliff to nuclear annihilation. We are here because we've been living a lie. As poor Lady Macbeth discovered, once you commit one crime, tell one lie, it multiplies. until you reach your tragic end. Unless you choose not to be tragic. We are here because we choose not to be tragic. The lying began at the end of World War II, at the death of FDR. We were told it was necessary to drop not one, but 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. It was not. The Emperor of Japan was already negotiating the terms of surrender through the Vatican. Our VE Day celebration of the defeat of the Nazis, which could not have happened without the enormous sacrifice of the Russian people, was short-lived.
I said that's right. That's right.
And instead of eradicating Nazism, the Dulles brothers, among others, protected Nazis in pockets, in our intelligence agencies, and in other nations in the name of fighting communism.
Yes.
Then we had the assassination of our president, John F. Kennedy, and the lie of the magic bullet shot by one lone assassin who apparently also killed Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. Then we had 9/11, allegedly perpetrated by some guy suffering kidney failure from a cave in Afghanistan. So today, we have the lie that one fine morning, President Vladimir Putin woke up and said, "Gee, I feel like invading Ukraine today." And idiots in our Congress who knew or should have known better decided to send over $100 billion to a pro-Banderist regime in Kiev, which we created to wage a proxy war against a nuclear superpower. And now we have the lies about the menacing Chinese balloons. This will not end unless we stop it by standing for the truth. And the truth is that mankind deserves better. There is a movement afoot, a revival of the non-aligned spirit, where nations are uniting, as in the BRICS, the SCO, the Eurasian Economic Union, in a new order based on mutual respect and a commitment to eradicate the common causes of the enemies of mankind, such as poverty, disease, and hunger, without sacrificing sovereignty. Rather than try to crush this new paradigm, the United States should join it. Millions are suffering in our own nation because of our foolish insistence on being the global hegemon. The Pope has offered the Vatican for peace talks without preconditions. President Lula of Brazil has proposed founding a bloc of nations to create a peace organization. I, along with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who you heard, support these calls for negotiations. It doesn't matter if you like or dislike the initiators. We should act in the spirit of Marian Anderson, who, in spite of the ugly racism which had prevented her from singing at Constitution Hall 84 years ago, accepted the invitation of Eleanor Roosevelt to sing here on these steps on Easter Sunday, 1939.
If they'll let her in,
to the amazement of all, She began the program by singing, "My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, let freedom ring."
So, Diane,
Yes.
why don't you tell us why you decided to speak that way? A lot of people were raging against the war machine. That didn't seem like a lot of rage against the war machine. It seemed like something different.
Well, I have been grappling with an idea which I didn't express there, but which is in my mind, and I think the citizens of the United States in particular, but all of us in the West have to consider from Belshazzar's feast, many, many take a parson. We have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. And what do I mean by that? Well, take the United States. If we are not a total dictatorship, then we are responsible for the actions of our government. And the fact that we were able to assemble at this rally, that we are not, I'm not sitting in prison right now. Maybe that will happen later, but I'm not at the moment. The fact that we were able to organize this event using Facebook, email, social media, that people can go in and meet with their congressman, that Jose Vega has been able to disrupt town hall meetings over and over again, and he has not been locked in a gulag somewhere, indicates that we still have the power to change the course of the actions of our government. And the world has to be looking at us. If you can imagine being someone in Afghanistan watching your child die of starvation, or a Ukrainian soldier conscripted against your will, suffering from pneumonia in some waterlogged trench, watching people die all around you, these people have to be holding us accountable for the actions of their government, and they are right. We are living in the moment which caused many of us to act in the first place, the moment where we wondered, how was it that the German people did not stop Adolf Hitler? How was it that they could have gone about their business, making excuses for themselves, even perhaps doing this or that, or saying they simply didn't know, they had absolutely no idea what was going on? The world did not accept that. They'd like to brush it under the rug now, but there was this idea of know or should have known, which I said. And I think this is the very stark question that has to be faced by the American people. We have been lied to again and again and again. And rather than fight back or reject these lies or demand the truth, we have found it expedient to go along with it. So that's why I said what I said. I think that the rally indicates the beginning of a new potential. The dynamic there was extraordinary. There were people there who have yanked the microphone away from me at meetings, people who have not minor but substantive disagreements, who decided to put all of that aside and recognize that if we don't stop the threat of thermonuclear war, that all these other disagreements are not going to mean anything, and we won't ever be able to resolve them, if they can be resolved, or not resolve them. I think there are certain things we can't agree to disagree on. I think there's the principle of truth. But this decision made very sensuous what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been saying about the coincidence of opposites, because what you found was there was a kind of goodwill amongst everyone, including the participants in the demonstration, when there were a group of about 15 people with Ukrainian flags, or some guy dressed in a clown suit, intermingling with the crowd, trying to provoke people. No one was provoked. No one fell for that. And I think we see this similar dynamic in seedling form, I guess you would say, in the demonstrations that have taken place all over the world over these last days. And I think we have to really reach out to each other to make sure that there is a certain strength and quality in unity. One of the things that some of my associates did at this rally was to gather, as people were going from the rally to the march, to sing the canon Dona Nobis Pacem. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to bring into this movement is singing. There's a reason why people sang, or I should say many reasons why people sang in the civil rights movement. It helps to elevate your mind and identity outside of the danger of what may happen to you physically. It also creates a sense of unity, a very important sense of unity, where people are unified in those areas that make them human. It also has the quality of even touching the heart and spirit of those who you may think are opposed to you, because you're doing something which is beautiful and also indicates a certain kind of vulnerability. But that's, I guess we can talk more. I really think everybody should take to heart, if there is a civilization, if we succeed in averting what could be Armageddon, people will rightly ask, why did the people of the United States not act? Why did the Germans make the same mistake again? And the Germans are beating the Americans. They have many more numbers out in the streets. But we have to, it's not enough to have your name on the list or to sign a document and say, well, I was on the right side. That is not sufficient. We actually have to change the policy, and we have to elevate the peace is not the absence of war. You will never succeed, even if we somehow get a change in the policy now of provoking Russia. If that stops, what prevents us from moving on to China? What prevents us from committing more atrocities, allowing the people of Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Nigeria, elsewhere to simply starve to death, allowing the people of Haiti to simply be used as a drug transshipment point and burn charcoal and starve? What prevents all of this? It's a change in our identity and a recognition of the 10th of Helga's 10 principles, that mankind is good. Mankind is fundamentally good. Mankind is capable of self-perfection. Not that we will be perfect, but what you love in other human beings is the potential for them to become perfect. And that is something that we have to fight for in ourselves and in the rest of humankind. So I think that what China has outlined is brilliant. It demonstrates the complete vacuum of leadership coming from the West. And I do think we are potentially at a turning point, but I think we have to shelter this little flame which has been lit and move it into something much bigger, with the idea that we are not doing this for appearances. We are doing it to actually move mankind into a new paradigm.
Okay, well, thank you, Diane. And I'm going to bring everybody up, but you prompted something in the last part of your remarks, particularly with respect to China. And I think what I'm going to do is just show something to people, and so that because it will also prompt something from Harley. This is actually a video from '78 when Jimmy Carter is first announcing the change in policy with respect to China. I think people should just sort of hear it, and you'll see why you'll have comments on it.
Give me a second to bring that one up, Dennis.
Okay, you have to take a minute to bring that up. Okay, while you're doing that, we also have, we're getting a few comments in from these various rallies as they've transpired, and I think we have a video from a parliamentarian who was interviewed by one of our people. I think I was in Denmark, so we'll come to that also in just a minute. Jose, you know what you do? Let me know when you're ready, and I'll just ask Harley first of all if he has anything to say in response to particularly what Mike had to say. I've got a couple questions for Mike myself, but Harley?
Well, I think it was very useful for Mike to have a chance to present what he was prepared to present at the Syria conference last Tuesday. I would recommend that everyone watching this go to that archived video of the Syria event, and then add to that what you heard from Mike, because what we're dealing with gets at the point that Diane was just making. You know, what kind of people do you find with Blinken and his type who justify sanctions that are killing children, who have no complaint or are not a threat to the United States? These are 3, 4, 5-year-old children, boys and girls, who are being saved from under boulders and the destruction of these buildings. They're freezing, they're cold. Why would the Treasury withhold the funds that would go to help them? And why are they doing that? Well, it brings me, I just wanted to make one point that I left out of my presentation, but I think is worth noting. When we talk about the goodness of human beings, we have to acknowledge that a certain portion of human beings, because of greed, because of ignorance, because of incomplete development, do things that are evil. And 2 examples. In Syria, the United States ended up supporting a regime change operation against the Assad government, allying itself with ISIS and al-Qaeda terrorists. In Ukraine, we're funding militia and arming militia that are allied with neo-Nazi, real Nazis. You know, if you think about this, how can the U.S. justify? The average American citizen wouldn't stand for this if they knew it. And that's the importance of the other part of what Diane was saying and what Mike presented. There is a truth that's knowable. And this is what Lyndon LaRouche's talk we had at the beginning was about. You have to develop your capability to know what that truth is and to be able to weed that out from the narratives that are being presented. And it's the goodness of most human beings that should, if we're inspired and kicked to do so, that we will find out what that truth is and act on it. But it does require a lot. And what we're seeing now with people getting into the streets in Paris and Rome, in Washington, in Austin, Texas, and today in Berlin, that people will respond. And it's that loving kick in the rear end sometimes it's necessary to get people to act on their human qualities.
Yeah, just as an example, again, of what this point is that we're trying to make to everybody over and over about the issue of truth, we'll show this video and you'll all have a response to it, I think. But it's from 1978 and it's Jimmy Carter.
Good evening. I would like to read a joint communique which is being simultaneously issued in Peking at this very moment by the leaders of the People's Republic of China. A joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, January 1st, 1979. The United States of America and the People's Republic of China have agreed to recognize each other and to establish diplomatic relations as of January the 1st, 1979. The United States recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as a sole legal government of China. Within this context, the people of the United States will maintain cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. The United States of America and the People's Republic of China reaffirm the principles agreed on by the two sides in the Shanghai Communique of 1972 and emphasize once again that both sides wish to reduce the danger of international military conflict. Neither should seek hegemony, that is, the dominance of one nation over others, in the Asia-Pacific region or in any other region of the world, and each is opposed to efforts by any other country or group of countries to establish such hegemony. Neither is prepared to negotiate on behalf of any other third party or to enter into agreements or understandings with the other directed at other states. The government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. Both believe that normalization of Sino-American relations is not only in the interest of the Chinese and American peoples, but also contributes to the cause of peace in Asia and in the world. The United States of America and the People's Republic of China will exchange ambassadors and establish embassies on March the 1st, 1979, unquote. Yesterday, our country and the People's Republic of China reached this final historic agreement. On January the 1st, 1979, a little more than 2 weeks from now, our two governments will implement full normalization of diplomatic relations. As a nation of gifted people who comprise about 1/4 of the total population of the earth, China plays already an important role in world affairs, a role that can only grow more important in the years ahead. We do not undertake this important step for transient tactical or expedient reasons. In recognizing the People's Republic of China, that it is a single government of China, we are recognizing simple reality. But far more is involved in this decision than just the recognition of a fact. Before the estrangement of recent decades, the American and the Chinese people had a long history of friendship. We've already begun to rebuild some of those previous ties. Now, our rapidly expanding relationship requires the kind of structure that only full diplomatic relations will make possible.
All right, so any comment upon that? For example, what the hell was Nancy Pelosi doing, and what the hell are we doing now, if that's the actual policy of the United States?
Well, I'll make two quick points. I mean, the first one that's interesting is it took 30 years to recognize China. The Chinese Revolution was 1949, and we had no diplomatic relations for 30 years. So when you talk about recognizing reality, that's one part of it. But what struck me is when Jimmy Carter read the statement, do not seek hegemony. Well, what is the rules-based order? What is the sole superpower, the idea that we have right now, the unipolar order? That's the U.S. asserting hegemony. So not to make Jimmy Carter into a paragon of virtue, because he was not. But the important thing is that if you look back at that speech, and the question you raised, Dennis, Nancy Pelosi violating the one China policy, we took 30 years to recognize reality, and now we've gone back in another direction. So, it's very useful to review history, provided you're open to the idea that you can learn from what you're reviewing.
Yes. Diane, any thoughts?
I also was struck by this question of not seeking to become the hegemon one over the other, but also there's a certain reality. Some people who may or may not be that good or philosophical might recognize that there are certain real principles in the world. You would hope that people could at least recognize that today. About 75 to 80% of or more of the world's population simply is no longer with this Anglo-Dutch imperial system. And therefore, if we wish to survive, maybe we have to acknowledge that. And then there's the question of actually embracing it and going beyond. But I think minimally, you see that President Carter actually was capable of understanding, as he said, China at the time had 25% of the world's population. How could you simply ignore that, write them off, and act like they didn't exist?
Okay. We have one of the, let's go to the video that we have of the Danish parliamentarian. I'd like to just show that for a moment.
Maria Krarup, thank you a lot for your speech at the demonstration here at the City Hall place in Copenhagen. A demonstration for stopping NATO's war against Ukraine, in Ukraine actually. So I would just like to ask you if you could say some words about why you spoke at this demonstration, and if you would like to send some greetings to the demonstrators in the US who are right now demonstrating for stopping the war.
I would very much like to say to everybody that you should try to stop the politicians sending weapons to Ukraine. It's necessary to start negotiations as soon as possible, and that is of course only possible if we stop sending weapons. So that is my message to the Danish population, but of course also to other populations in NATO countries. Stop sending weapons.
Thank you a lot. And then one other question is,
sorry?
Is there a reaction in the military? Is there a reaction in the Danish institutions for stopping this war? Because the media.
I don't see any reaction. There's 100% of, unfortunately, support for sending weapons, I think, in Denmark, both in the population and among politicians and institutions. I mean, those who are against it are standing here. It's very few, unfortunately, but I would want them to be more and more.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I hope this is also just the beginning of a lot of demonstrations, yes. Because we know there are planned demonstrations very soon. The next one, the 25th. One more question is, what would you like to say concerning this development around the South America, who is supporting the Pope's initiative for peace agreement or the peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine?
I think that's very, very good. Of course, it's necessary to have negotiations as soon as possible. But as long as we are sending weapons to Ukraine, I don't think that it will come to that. So, therefore, I think the fastest way to negotiations is to tell the populations in NATO countries, try to put pressure on the politicians to make them stop sending weapons to Ukraine.
Thank you a lot.
Okay, so actually I want to ask you something, Mike, because you were seeming to indicate a few things about what was happening there. I know there are preliminary reports coming in from the demonstrations there. That actually was from last week, by the way, that video and in Copenhagen. And but just wanted to see if you had any, not just response to what you saw, but your view of what has been happening or maybe about to occur there in England. You often emphasize to us that things aren't necessarily what they seem, and you seem to be indicating in the pro-Ukrainian demonstration that you indicated there's a bit of a more complex situation there.
Well, Peter Tatchell is a long-time campaigner on, as I say, gay rights issues and other hate crime related, well, at least what he would claim to be hate crime related issues. He is seen by many as being a mouthpiece for government, I suppose. But I just thought it was really interesting that he, in particular, was chosen to lead the counter demonstrations day. If I think back over the last 30 years or so, if I think back to the Iraq War, and something between 1 million and 2 million people came out on the streets in London. This was at the height of the Stop the War Coalition's powers, I suppose you could say, but it was well over 1 million people came out into Hyde Park in London to try to convince Tony Blair that he should not go ahead with his action in Iraq. And as far as that went, it was a very good day and so on. But when Tony Blair then decided that he was going to do it in spite of the public opposition, the opposition seemed to crumble. And so there were no follow-up demonstrations. And I think if that 1 million people had decided to simply the following weekend come back to London, sit themselves down outside Parliament and refuse to move until that decision was changed again, then the decision probably would have been changed. I hope that the demonstrations that we've seen over this last period are going to continue, that the pressure is going to continue, because I think that without sustained pressure, we're not going to succeed in stopping the arms, at least in principle, because of course we're rapidly running out of them in reality. But nonetheless, the idea of war needs to be removed from the and of regime change, it needs to be removed from the political dialogue, I think, and the only way that's going to be done is if people are willing to, for the long term, or at least the medium term, push as hard as they possibly can, and we can't make the same mistake that was made in 2003.
Yeah, actually, go ahead, Harley.
Yeah. An important point Mike just made, and the fact that we're running out of arms in the West. And this has been discussed extensively in the United Kingdom. Tobias Ellwood, among others, who calls for British boots on the ground, nevertheless admits that Britain does not have the industrial capability to sustain a war. But it's not just military equipment that's missing. We don't have food. We don't have medicine. We don't have trained medical personnel. We don't have transportation capabilities. We don't have electricity. So we're facing a fundamental existential crisis, and war is often used to substitute an enemy image abroad for the failure of the leaders of the country that's going to war. And I think this is an important point that people have to really internalize. And Mike's point is very well taken. A single demonstration doesn't win a fight. It's got to be sustained. Each week you have to bring more people into it. It means that each of us have to become more effective at communicating not just the objective reality to break the narratives, but at reaching inside the hearts and souls of people to get them to reflect on what it means to be a vassal for a bunch of people who hate humanity. And it's that ability to lift people up. And I think this is one of the things that Diane did with her campaign so effectively, that even as you talk about the evil of your opponents, and in her case, Schumer is quite an evil guy, but people know that. Why don't they rise up against him? Because they doubt their own goodness, their own capability. And that's where we have to be much more effective, not just being persistent in fighting the narrative, but in reaching out to others and giving them a sense of what it means to be human.
Actually, let me do the following. Even if you have something to say about this, Diane, you'll be able to put it in this context. We have a few questions from the chat, and here's one of them. These don't have names associated with them. But why are we risking nuclear war when there is still a chance that an asteroid could kill all of life on Earth? Can't we unite and work together to discover something new? So that's the question. I pose that to you, Diane.
Well, it's always hard to imagine a catastrophe that has not yet struck. That's why LaRouche was so unique as a forecaster, and happily his wife, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, has really picked up on that with a number of her initiatives. It's absolutely the right question. Also, the question of starvation of new technologies to address these things. And I love the asteroid problem because that really demands breakthroughs, as LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative demanded. Or you might equally ask about earthquake forecasting, because one of the friends of the LaRouche movement, a Russian scientist by the name of Sergei Poulinets, has demonstrated, as one would suspect, given the amount of energy that's released in an earthquake or a tsunami, that these things should be forecastable. Would it have made a difference in Turkey or Syria, even if they'd had 24 hours notice, let alone a week or two? And I think, again, this gets back to the love of mankind. When you talk about mankind, you talk about humanity. What makes us lovable? It's not because our physical features are so great. I mean, we're kind of used to them, but frankly, we're kind of funny-looking creatures if you try to think of it abstractly. But it's this quality of creativity, this quality of understanding and being able to participate in the ongoing creation of the universe. And I think some of the photographs we're now getting, the images we're getting from the Webb telescope, give us much more sense that this idea of the law of entropy, this depressing, horrible theory that everything's just winding down into a Nietzschean null void where everything we've done is going to be meaningless, not only is unpleasant, but simply is not true.
Okay. Harley, there's a question here. Has there ever been an international solidarity of the magnitude that we're seeing now? If there has been, how similar or different is it to this? And if not, how do we continue to increase this?
Well, I think that's something I'd have to take a look at and study to see if there is something quite like that. There are some moments, for example, at the end of wars where you have outpourings of people into the streets, or one example, when Apollo 13 was in trouble and the whole world was gripped for a few moments, not just over the lives of the three men in the spacecraft, but over the potential tragedy. But I think the important thing is that we are seeing something that is potentially different. And what's important about it is that those of us who live in the Western world, the so-called Anglo-Dutch Empire or the special relationship or whatever, we have to take into our hearts and our minds why it is that the rest of the world, the global South, is opposing the policies coming from Washington and London and Brussels, and recognize that we have been a horrible caretaker of humanity. That while we've been enjoying our lives, even if they're not so enjoyable, there are people around the world who still don't have hot and cold running water, who don't have electricity, and that we have to do a better job. And this is an opportunity. Instead of seeing this as a moment born out of dire danger, it's an opportunity to demonstrate that quality of human kindness as a strategic policy. And I think that's what, if you boil down Helga's fundamental principles, that's what she's getting at, that we as a human race have to do better. We have to enter into an age of adulthood and put aside our childish things and become truly human toward each other. So whether this is the biggest realization of that yet or not remains to be seen. Each of us has to make that our mission. And I think that's the best way I would answer that.
Okay, Mike, there's a question that came in, sort of a general question, but it's probably important to ask it, which was, who has done any kind of a thorough expose of the white helmets? Question says, I think that Seymour Hersh did an expose on the claim, I think in 2012, of a Syrian chemical attack. But is there anyone that's actually done the work on this?
The main voice against the white helmets is Vanessa Bailey. So she has a blog at the wallwillfall.org. She's also on Substack. But a lot of her writing is on 21stcenturywire.com, which is Pat Kenningson's website. So there's a lot of, going back to 2014, 2015, I think. So there's lots of content out there, but she certainly has been leading the charge. Other voices, John Pilger is one of the sort of major mainstream voices that has been writing about the white helmets and what they actually are over a period of time as well. But Vanessa would be a good place to start.
Okay, very good. And I'll just also reference again to people that we said about the bill that's in the Congress to force the United States to withdraw troops from Syria. We will probably try to, again, get some particulars, but if you're interested in helping us on that, just make sure you get in touch with us through the video, through the website, or contacts that you know that are working on this. I think we've got one, or probably only one, of the videos from the interventions from this past week. There were so many different requests about what can people do or what to do afterwards. I think what we'll just do is to show one of the expressions of us doing this. I believe this is the intervention against Hakeem Jeffries, who is a prominent individual in the Democratic Party these days. Do we have that, Jose?
There's an error. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Okay, my apologies, coming in now.
Okay.
The UN Security Council had a meeting yesterday, and Ray McGovern spoke to it. He is a former member of the CIA, and he testified in support of Seymour Hersh's article on the United States bombing Nord Stream pipeline. If it is proven that the United States bombed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, as has been asserted by Seymour Hersh and his article, will you call for the United States to acknowledge and admit that that was an act of war against Germany and Russia? And I'm asking this because this may be the only way to prevent the rest of us from being killed in a thermonuclear war. And I don't want to be fried. Don't you think the media should be reporting on whether or not this is true? And don't you think you should be inquiring into whether or not this is true?
Well, thank you for the question. One, I've got no information to suggest that the United States was involved in bombing the Nord Stream pipeline.
Because you weren't briefed on it.
Sir, you got your chance to ask a question.
So you give me an opportunity to respond.
You weren't given information because he explicitly says you weren't briefed on it.
Right.
Shouldn't you inquire?
So here's what I'll say about, I think, President Biden's leadership generally as it relates to the Ukraine and Russia.
We committed an act of war. What are you doing to respond to that? We have to hold Biden accountable. So listen, you're from Brooklyn, right? You know when to call bullshit when you see it. So do I. This is bullshit right now. And I see what's happening right now. That does not silence me. So, you can hear me right now. I want you to say something about the bombing, because we're all going to die from a nuclear war right now unless you stop it and you at least put and inquire into whether or not it's true. This war in Ukraine is going to leave us all dead. So what are you going to do? Because you need to inquire. I'm a New Yorker too.
Here's what I'll say.
Say it.
We're going to continue to stand with the Ukrainian people.
That's end us all
in
dead.
this war against
We
Vladimir
need
Putin.
peace. We need talks.
Because
why are you sabotaging talks? Do not put your hands on me. We need peace talks. I am not going to take this.
It's a
we
battle
need peace talks.
It's a
You
battle
are leaving.
between
Listen.
democracy.
Did you even read the allegations?
And autocracy. It's a
no.
battle between
how about
truth
accountability,
and propaganda,
not airheadedness?
and it's a battle between
okay?
tyranny and freedom. And democracy,
okay? How about
truth, and freedom will
not
prevail.
cremation?
And the United States is going to help make sure that happens.
Not destruction. How about that?
I want to ask you to join me.
So it's possible to have a good time at airhead meetings if you're willing to say something about the truth. We may have a second, a different setting, I'll admit, which I believe we have Ray McGovern, who, for people who don't know, Ray was, of course, with us on Thursday on our presentation on Nord Stream, 27-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, who has made the point to a lot of his colleagues that they should be doing the kind of thing you just saw from Jose. And I believe we have a section of his appearance in front of the United Nations Security Council, which we can show at this point.
As a U.S. Army officer and as a CIA employee, I took an oath, one oath. It was to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Some of us took that oath seriously. And when we see this kind of thing going on, we go to somebody who might be able to protect us and might be able to get the word out. Now, this was 2 weeks ago. Has the New York Times mentioned Sy Hersh's article? Has it even reported the denials? No, not yet. This is quite, the Germans would say, merkwürdig. This is very, very remarkable. Now, let me go on here and talk about, how do we evaluate those who are smearing Seymour Hersh? Well, as Jeffrey Sachs has already said, the CIA spokesperson said, the claim is completely and utterly false, quote, end quote. Whoa. Now, I have to confess, being an alumnus of the CIA, that our PR people, our public relations people, do not have a very good record. No one wants to go back 20 years to Colin Powell's speech before this Security Council.
So, Mike, since you're a journalist, you work a lot with media, you've talked about it a lot, the manipulations. Tell us what your view is of what Sy Hersh has actually done, what his impact has been, what it can be, and what you think would need to be done in order for that story to actually achieve the kind of resonance that might actually change things.
Well, in the UK, just as in the United States, it seems there is media blackout of it. So, but social media still exists, and although it's increasingly difficult to use because of censorship regimes and so on, I think that that needs to be everywhere, and it needs to be everywhere very quickly. I'm just going to say that as far as Jose's intervention, you guys in the United States are very fortunate that your politicians are still willing to hold those types of public meetings. We do not get that opportunity. If anybody wants to speak to their elected representative in this country, the best they can do is to go to have a private meeting with them. There are no public meetings of that kind except for at general election time or some kind of parliamentary election. So that the opportunity to directly intervene in that with that style is very rare. Doorstepping them in their constituency, if you happen to be lucky enough to know where they might be at any particular time, is possible, but it's relatively difficult. So in the US, you're in a very good position, but I think it's incumbent upon us all to start getting this Seymour Hersh article out on social media, but also start challenging our so-called elected representatives about it in a much more direct way, which obviously, you're able to do easier than we are, but everybody needs to be getting involved in doing that, I think.
Well, I'm going to ask, actually, I think that's an interesting observation you made about the difference in the systems. Harley, what strikes you about this Seymour Hersh? Because it's not one article. As we know, it seems to be a series that he's sort of unloading as he's going along here. What do you think the impact of this has been, and what do you think has to be done to create this situation where it becomes a hegemonic resonance?
Well, not only is he doing a series of articles, but all of a sudden he's doing a lot of interviews. And again, as Mike just said, sometimes you have to look pretty hard to find the interviews, but they're out there. And he clearly has a sense that he's touching something of existential importance. Because I don't remember in the past that he was so insistent on himself getting the message out. And his recent interviews have been very effective, very sharp, and very focused. And I think what we're seeing is some in the alternative media are responding in a very interesting way, just as they are responding to the kind of intervention that Jose and his collaborators are doing. We saw, what was it, on Rising on the Hill, where they did a piece on that a day or two ago, the Hakeem Jeffries intervention. So we're catching on. We're at a moment where all people are hearing is the party line. And by party line, I mean both parties in the United States have the same line, which is we have to stay the course. This is going to be a long war. We have to stay with it. There's no alternative. And that's not a popular message. But no one in the Congress, or very few in the Congress, are saying that. But when you see someone of Hersh's stature being combative with it, and then you see someone like Jose standing up and speaking truth to power, it becomes a teaching moment. And I think one of the interviews done with Jose, they talked about doing a course on Intervention 101. Well, the key thing in an intervention like that is you have to know the subject, but you have to be courageous to the extent that you realize that you have to get the story out. And I think that's the key thing. And we have to be creative and assertive to put ourselves in positions to do that. But that's the only thing that will create a change right now, because even with social media, the question is touching people individually with the sense of their own personal responsibility to the future. And that's the way we have to approach this. And I think it will work.
Well, Diane, you've done those interventions, and you also had a campaign which was nothing but a nonstop intervention, and against people who were rather powerful and were, pretty nasty in their own way. Then there's the rally itself, which was an intervention because you had to intervene to get us into the rally, so to speak, or to get the people who were organizing the rally up to a certain level to understand why this idea of the unity of opposites was real. So what's your view of how you think, not merely the story about Seymour Hersh, but all of the kind of breaks that we're beginning to see? What happens, or what has to happen for this to become a hegemonic kind of resonance pattern? Maybe not with 300 million people in America being involved. We don't need that, but enough people to actually change the situation. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was thinking about the Congressman Gates legislation to get our troops out of Syria. This is very important. And my husband happens to have spent with some other organizers the last few days out on the street campaigning in his district, and they have met dozens. This district is just full of military bases in Florida. So these people are coming up and saying things like, there's a difference between defending ourselves from an aggressor and going out and starting aggressive war against nations that haven't attacked us. They feel very passionately about this. And of course, these are people who know firsthand the horrors of what is going on in many of these countries that have been invaded by the United States. So one thing I was thinking about is what would the impact be of these people from his district, he clearly has a sense of what the people in his district want, which is to get our soldiers out of there. They didn't make it their life's mission to want to steal wheat and oil from people who are starving in a war-torn nation. They don't want to be away from their families for no purpose except to bring about destruction. And I think that Americans are not really aware that this is the sense of many people in our armed forces, even though now we have close to 3 million Americans who have served in wars since 9/11 and their extended family. But this is not something that's much discussed. But the power of something like what we saw at the Rage Against the War Machine rally Sunday is when people begin to come together who have not been talking to each other in the past, who rather than being in a confrontational mindset are now listening in a different kind of mindset, then you can begin to get a sense of how this can move. I think there should be a huge mobilization around this legislation, for example. How much would that change things if we were forced to get our troops out of Syria, among many other changes that have to be made? So I think this is kind of the process, doing things, figuring out how to get people to think. That's the biggest challenge, how to get people to think. And that means doing things that are discontinuous, out of the ordinary, unexpected, humorous, scary, just provoking what's better in people. I also would appeal to everyone watching this who is in the United States who could have an opportunity to do interventions like this. Please do it. Also, since we do have social media, to a certain degree, you can go. I had a friend in Connecticut who went to visit the FBI because he wanted to ask them some questions, and he just had a friend along videotaping the exchange, or the fact that they wouldn't let him in and wouldn't answer his questions, and then he was able to put that out on social media. So you might say, well, that's not exactly the same effect as doing it in a crowded room, but actually that kind of thing can be quite effective. So those are some of my thoughts on this.
Well, thank you very much for this. I think, let me just ask if there's anything anyone would like to say in closing. We're sort of right at the end of the program. I think I'm going to make again an appeal that people should do some things around the Syria matter. Go to our Syrian Sanctions Must Be Lifted symposium, which was this past Tuesday. There's a series of presentations, including one by Vanessa Beeley. You heard earlier Mike Robinson talk about her as being the person that's done the most work on the question of the white helmets. So go there for that information. There's also a symposium we also did on Thursday around the Nord Stream pipeline. Ray McGovern was one of the people that spoke there. Also, Helga Zepp-LaRouche spoke both at that and the Tuesday forum. So you can get a lot more there. It's called Investigate Nord Stream Revelations, Stop Nuclear War, World War III. You see the list of speakers. And we are also making some of these presentations available separately up on the sites, so you can do that as well. Before we conclude, is there anything, Mike, you have anything you'd like to add? Any final words that you feel you need to make?
No, I think we covered it today. I mean, I'll just mention, we did have the power failure on Tuesday, which knocked me off the call. But the other issue that's going on in the UK at the moment is a food shortage. So keep an eye on that one, because this is all related to the fact that we are utterly not food independent, reliant on imports, and if other countries aren't growing, we're starving. So we're heading in that direction very rapidly here. That just goes back to Harley's comments about war being used as a cover-up for these types of issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks. Harley?
Nope. I've said my piece tonight.
You've said everything you said you need to say. Okay. Diane?
I would tell everybody here to get off their rear end and start doing what you can. And if you don't think you can change history, then think again and figure it out what it is that you can do and do it.
All right. So Diane Sayre, Mike Robinson, Harley Schlanger, thank you very much. I'd like to just say to people as we close that if you look at what we've now covered throughout the program, from China and from this new peace proposal and the profound importance of it, to Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 principles, to Lyndon LaRouche discussing the idea of what an idea and what a discovery is, there's a process of deliberation which we are trying to encourage throughout the world, and we carried out here today as well. Over the course of the next week, as with the previous week, there will be a lot of developments, and it's important for people to do everything they can to be not just informed of them, but to be informed in order to act. The interventions and the point that was made by Mike Robinson about the significantly singular nature of American politics, the fact that it is still open as long as people decide to open the door to keep it open, and that interventions and challenges and debates and discussions have to be forced at this time, but with an idea of what the solution is. You can't just talk about the problem. You have to talk about the idea of the alternative. The 10 principles of a new security and development architecture deal with that. It's specifically what the economic policy is that must underlie an actual security architecture. Already in the world, there's a majority of the people who, whether they are working with the Belt and Road Initiative of China, or they're working with variations with the so-called Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, or BRICS assembly, already are moving in that direction. But the United States can be catalytic either for evil or for good. I think we all know that. But there's a new kind of United States that has to assert itself. It has to assert itself by means of the kind of thing that you're seeing in on the one hand, the testimony of Ray McGovern in the halls of the United Nations Security Council, or on the streets of America in Brooklyn or the Bronx, as you saw with Jose Vega's intervention. But this is our world, and the world that we are going to choose to leave behind for generations to come will be one either of ashes or will be one of great aspiration and great development, and understanding, a new understanding among people. This is what we seek, and certainly the demonstrations that are going on today and yesterday and tomorrow throughout the world indicate that people are ready to be challenged to make a discovery of how to think. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank everybody for watching today, and we'll see you again here next week.